That is really freaking cute right there. So let's talk about essay writing. Most of us dread essay writing because essay writing is a type of writing which we're not familiar with. We don't grow up with reading essays. We grow up with reading novels, with reading articles, with reading magazines. Essays? No, we don't read any essays until we come to the age where we need to start writing essays, which means writing an essay is really freaking terrifying for the first time. And that doesn't matter how good at writing you are. There is a huge difference between being a good writer and being an effective writer. You can have excellent prose weaving skills and with perfect grammar and a phenomenal vocabulary. But if you cannot communicate your ideas in a clear and comprehensible way, your essay won't perform as well as you deserve it to. One of the best tidbits of advice that a lecturer ever gave me was telling me that I should write every essay as though I'm writing a letter to a dear friend who has no bloody idea what I'm talking about, but I'm really passionate and excited to tell them all about my research. And I think that's a really nice way to get ahead of the essay writing game. It's something that needs to be formal, but not too formal. Be entertaining, be a bit interesting. So before we get into the essay writing techniques, let's talk about research. And that's a major important factor in this. But I've already done a whole video about how to research effectively, which I will leave in the iCards here. So you may want to watch that before you carry on with this video. So now we've done our research, let's talk about why we need to write an essay. The point of an essay or any research paper is to go beyond regurgitation of research and demonstrate to the reader, i.e. your marker, that you are capable of engaging critically with a subject or material at hand. The first challenge that most students have to face when they're dealing with an essay is choosing what they want to write about. There are obviously two kinds of scenarios. The first is when the essay titles are already suggested by a lecturer and the student has to pick from a list that is demonstrated for them, normally the norm for undergraduates at the first few years, and obviously exam situations. And then there's the other kind of essay where you get to pick from free range your own subject, your own title, etc. The self-conceptualized essay isn't something that you normally face in your first few years of undergraduate, but even then, after years of writing essays, most people find the idea of formulating their own essay title quite intimidating. So let's start with the basics. Let's talk about premeditated essay titles. When it comes to picking from a list, it is really obvious and important that you go with what you're familiar with. However, there is also a hugely important factor that most people overlook when it comes to picking the essays. Looking at the interrogatives, i.e. whether the question is a why, a how, a what, etc. So take for example a literature student in their exam. They're faced with 3 questions, one about Oliver Twist, one about Jane Eyre, and one about Wuthering Heights. Our student in this example read all of the books. However, they freaking loved Jane Eyre, so they jump on the opportunity to write about Jane Eyre. However, the student didn't consider the interrogative of the question. When it comes to writing an essay, the interrogative of the question is more important to focus on than the subject matter at hand, because the interrogatives dictate the writing approach of your essay. They determine whether or not the marker is looking for an analytical, a theoretical, or an explanatory response to the question. And it's unlikely, despite how much you love your subject matter, that you've researched all the different approaches to a subject matter. So our student could have studied everything to do with Jane Eyre in terms of imagery and context, but they didn't study the linguistic tools and techniques employed by Bronte, which means they aren't able to effectively and successfully answer a question when asked how the author achieved something. The interrogatives, therefore, are incredibly important when you're in charge of formulating your own essay titles. So think about whether or not your research has been based on theoretical, analytical, contextual, or evaluative readings and choose the interrogative which is best suited to your research interests. After that, nobody can tell you what you want to write about. Only you know what has been interesting you whilst you've been researching and studying this for the past few months or even potentially years. So choose something which you know you'll enjoy exploring. But please don't put pressure on yourself to be original. I'll say it again. If you're an undergraduate, nobody expects you to be the newest prodigy who creates groundbreaking theories and opens up a whole new field of research. And by the time you do your masters, you should know what interests you. So stay true to you and write an essay that you know you would love to read. So next, let's talk about the essay plan, because obviously you should be planning your essay before you go into writing it. However, I will dip on this later in the video, so there's a little explanation point that I'll come back to, so stay tuned for that. When it comes to writing a plan, there is no point writing a detailed plan, because then you might as well have written your blooming essay. The plan should be broken down into 5 core areas. 1, your introduction. 2, the research supporting your position. 3, the research against your position. 4, defending and explaining your argument, and 5, conclusion. So let's break down all of these points. 1, introduction. Everyone hates writing an introduction because nobody taught us how significant introductions are. And what I mean by that is that most of us actually over-glorify introductions and think they're more significant than they are, and therefore write introductions that go beyond what they need to be. Introductions are important, but they don't need to be complicated, and they're not this kind of magical, mystical, groundbreaking thing. Keep it nice and simple because that's what your market is looking for. Your introduction is where you explain to your reader what you're trying to convince them to believe and how you intend to convince them to believe that. Tell your reader what you are going to prove, the stages you are going to take the reader through, and the conclusions you are going to draw at the end. Yes, you give your spoiler alerts. However, don't unravel your argument in the introduction or give away your best analysis, but give a clinical lowdown on what your essay is going to be about, what the argument will conclude, what theories, techniques, and methods you're going to employ, and what process you're going to go through as succinctly as possible. So, in effect, your introduction should say, here is the argument I am going to make. I am going to justify my argument by taking on these 3 or 4 arguments, drawing upon these theorists who say these things, and I will conclude some thoughts on this discussion and how it might clarify our understanding as a subject as a whole. Moving on from our introduction, we need to talk about arguments posed for and against your piece. Now, I won't go over well-trodden ground here because sections 2 and 3 depend largely on the research you conducted, and obviously I covered how to find arguments for and against your position in my research video. However, what I should emphasize here again, as I do in the other video, is don't include everything you've ever found on your subject matter and topic ever. Keep to what is incredibly interesting and relevant to your discussion, and you don't have to agree with the research you reference in this section, including the research that may actually align with your overall conclusion. Keep 2 and 3 quite professional and educational. Make it your intention in these sections to share your knowledge, educate and enlighten your reader on what you've come across in your research. Because now step 4 is interesting, because that's your time to shine. Defending and explaining your argument should take up the majority of your essay, and this is where you employ a range of approaches, including analysing, critiquing, adding to and defending the arguments you discussed in sections 2 and 3. Close text analysis in your field of research, which demonstrates your independent thought to the marker. Elaboration on your theories and approaches, which are unique to you, whilst using further evidence to support your claims, which may include contextual information and external references, which extend beyond the localized theme of the primary and secondary resources. And, to hit really high marks, critique your own arguments. Show the reader that you have self-awareness of your own fallibility and weaknesses, and highlight the potential holes in your argument. Trust me, they'll love that. Another core part of section 4 is ensuring that you know how to use quotes correctly. There may be dozens of quotes which support your essay beautifully, but they are utterly wasted if you don't employ the P method. Point, evidence, and explain. In other words, introduce your quote, give your quote, and then explain your quote. All quotes in this section should be managed this way. They shouldn't be dropped into an essay for the sake of adding poetic bulk to your word count. And finally, the second most hated part of an essay, the conclusion. The conclusion is where you summarize and synthesize the claims that you've made in your essay. Remind your reader what you proved in your essay, how you proved it, and discuss the implications of your argument, i.e., why we should care about your claims that you've made in your argument, and how your position on the subject may actually alter the field of study. Conclusion is not, and I repeat, not a place to insert a new argument or perspective. If you're adding a new argument or perspective into your conclusion, it ceases to be a conclusion. Once you've written your conclusion, make sure that your introduction is in sync with it, and by rereading your introduction to ensure it makes sense in the same grand scheme. Because sometimes as you're writing, things alter, and by the time you've written your conclusion, your introduction may be a little bit out of date. So you have to make sure that they're in sync and they don't astray from the approaches that you've ended up using throughout your essay. Then is the joy of rereading your entire essay as a whole, proofreading it and editing it along the way. Say this with the confidence that you've written your first draft a week before it is due to hand in, because trust me, if you work to this timescale, you'll thank yourself later. And yes, it can be done, because that's exactly how I did it throughout my undergraduate. With a job, it can be done. However, if you're doing your master's, I think a respectable time frame for proofreading is in the early hours the night before that is due in, because that's fine. Good luck, well done. Now, here's the exclamation point that I mentioned earlier on, which comes to the actual writing process, because there are two approaches. Some prefer to research independently before sitting down to writing their essay, whilst others prefer to write as they research. Now, these approaches depend on the individual and the confidence level that they have in their argument. In my undergraduate degree, I took the first approach. I used to research separately and then write afterwards. However, with a master's timescale, I ended up writing as I research. And this can be done quite easily if you make sure that all your citations are in check as you're writing through. So say that you're researching about something and you really like this particular quote, you think it's relevant to your topic, but you haven't got much of your essay written down, but you know you'd like to add your 2 cents onto this. Introduce your quote, use the quote, cite it correctly, and then add your 2 cents afterwards helps you slot in little sections of your essay all together quite neatly, quite compactly, and you can add to it and go along. It's a complicated method, but it works for many people, and I think more people need to talk about it. It requires practice, it requires patience, but if you're on a short time scale, it's a really effective way to write an essay, provided you are neat and tidy and organized as an individual, because it requires a lot of organization to get right, but it can be done. So if you're somebody who's never tried writing your essay as you research it, I highly recommend giving it a go, because you may actually find this is a skill that you can develop to help speed up your writing process as a whole. So that concludes my how to write an essay video. I hope you enjoyed the second part to the 2-part series. If there are anything else that you'd like me to elaborate on a different video about essay writing, please let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and consider please sharing it with anyone who may need some help with their essay writing right now. Until next time, books save lives, so keep reading.